we are so happy to be partnering with the Atlantica Centre for Energy on the creation of a new podcast series. Since this organization is focused on promoting a sustainable energy sector, it's a perfect match. Here's the first episode of Atlantica's Fuel for Thought, a Reimagined Energy Podcast, with host Jonathan Alward.
Welcome to the first Atlantic Fuel for Thought podcast brought to you by the Atlantica Centre for Energy in collaboration with Reimagined Energy. This is a podcast where you can learn about all things energy in Atlantic Canada. I'm Jonathan Alward, and I'm the Vice President for Policy with the Atlantica Centre for Energy. As the voice for energy in Atlantic Canada, Atlantica's members include many of the largest producers, distributors, and consumers of energy in the region. Our members represent nearly all sources of energy and all types of generation, from oil and gas to renewables and nuclear generation, to utilities and government, research and academic organizations, and of course the general public. Atlantica's goal is to power and develop the region responsibly to create a more prosperous future for Atlantic Canadians. We do this by developing partnerships, facilitating conversations, and by improving energy literacy. And that's why we've created this podcast series, to help Atlantic Canadians better understand the energy around them, its role in supporting the economy, and the opportunities that energy can provide to create a more prosperous, resilient, and clean future here. In this series, we're going to dive into understanding more about different types of energy used in Atlantic Canada, how important energy trade is for the region, and explore exciting development projects that are helping create a thriving, resilient, and clean future here. In this first episode, my guest and I will uncover the truth about wind by fact-checking some recent viral comments made about this source of energy. We'll discuss comments made by the President of the United States, Donald Trump, on January the 7th. These comments were about both onshore and offshore wind, but this episode will focus on onshore wind projects specifically, like many of those you can already see springing up across the Maritimes. We're going to also listen to some quotes from a popular new Paramount Plus show, Landman, where the main character explores wind energy in the oil and gas sector. Listeners and viewers can find links to these clips in the show notes. And it's now my pleasure to introduce my guest, Robb Apold, a principal of natural forces based in Halifax. Robb is a passionate advocate for clean energy and sustainability and has dedicated his career to advancing renewable energy industry. Robb graduated from the University of New Brunswick with a degree in mechanical engineering, and he's been working in this sector for over 20 years. He's a founder of Natural Forces and has played a key role developing and commercializing over 500 megawatts of renewable energy projects during his leadership both at GDF Suez and with Natural Forces. Robb's innovative thinking and leadership have guided Natural Forces to success, and he continues to drive the company forward and its mission to create a more sustainable future. Robb, thank you so much for joining. But before we begin, I'm wondering if you can share a little bit more about Natural Forces and the work that you're doing to develop wind and solar projects across Atlantic Canada.
Thanks, Jonathan. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak a little bit about my passion, which is renewable energy and specifically wind energy. Natural Forces is an all-encompassing firm. We deal with renewable energy from solar, wind, hydro, and storage, and are focused mainly on delivering these projects through community. So what does that mean? It means having community be part owners of the projects that we developed here. Our focus is mainly on the Canadian market, the Irish market, and the French market in Europe. We have a team of about 100 people now. Our main office is in Halifax, but we also have offices in Sussex, New Brunswick, Dublin, Ireland, and Nantes, France.
That's excellent. So let's jump right in and let's discuss first the new Paramount Plus series, Landman, and it's currently actually the 24th most popular show on TV according to Rotten Tomatoes. In Season 1, Episode 3, main character Tommy Norris gives a now viral speech outlining the character's thoughts on wind generation relative to oil production. This character is an executive of a fictional oil company in Texas, and he's played by, honestly, a very convincing Billy Bob Thornton. So Norris mentions that windmills are up to 400 feet tall, and their concrete foundation covers over a third of an acre and goes down 12 feet into the ground. Robb, can you walk me through how big some of the wind projects are here today in Atlantic Canada and what we can expect maybe their size and scale to look like here in the future?
Well, yeah, I certainly can. I mean, so many of my friends have sent me that clip from Landman. It's getting a little bit interesting for me, but what he says is partially true on the size of the turbines. The size of the turbines now, tip heights, that's the top of the tip to the basement, can be well over 500 feet now. They're getting larger, and the reason they're getting larger is because we're trying to have less impact on the bottom. We're trying to become more efficient. And the larger they get, the more efficient they are. The foundations can be very large. We find here actually in the Maritimes, we do a lot of rock anchor foundations, so not as many of the large buried ones. But the lovely part about wind energy and why it is so effective is that it has very little land usage. And so while the foundation can be buried, you can actually farm all the way right up to the base over top of those foundations. And the third of an acre is probably a little bit of an overstatement, but the size and height would be accurate.
Great, thank you. So Thornton's character goes on to state that windmills use alternative energy. There is nothing clean about it, he said, and its 20-year lifespan, it won't offset the carbon footprint of actually making it. So is this true? And how do emissions from some of the natural forces projects, for example, in the Maritimes, compared to those shared in the story in the Landman series?
Yeah, so this is not true. It wouldn't make sense that we use more oil to make a turbine and then have to have it pay back with less energy. It doesn't quite make a lot of sense, especially when he's saying that they last only 10 years. But anyway, let's take it from what the rule of thumb. The rule of thumb that we usually use, it's about 6 months of production is required to pay off the energy bill to build a wind turbine. This does change. It changed based on what you're building, what the design is of the actual wind turbine. But in general, the rule of thumb is about 6 months.
Great. And so does that cover the whole scope of, manufacturing the turbines, shipping them here, looking at types of land, forests that you might not be able to use the whole gamut?
No, it's not a full cycle. What that is that's what it costs to build the turbine. So the big cost, of course, is getting the steel. That's the big piece of it. Now, if you start taking into other, what is the cost of the diesel to lift the tower up? I mean, those will add on to it, but it's not a significant amount. I would say you're going to move from 6 months. Instead, you'll move up to 8 to 12 months instead. It's not a massive difference in carbon output for that.
And again, compared to what we'll discuss in a little bit, probably a much longer life cycle than what some people maybe have heard in different comments online recently.
Absolutely.
So speaking of which, let's jump to some of those comments made about onshore and offshore wind projects recently by the President of the United States, Donald Trump. At the time when he made them back in January 7th, he was then president-elect. But I first saw the interview shared by Global News, and I would say the following quotes that we're going to discuss aren't in order, but we've also made sure they're not taken out of context. So if any of the listeners or viewers want to watch the interviews in their entirety, they can do so through a link in the show notes. So referring to onshore windmills, President Trump said, "The most expensive energy ever. They only work if you get a subsidy. The only people that want them are the people that are getting rich off windmills, getting massive subsidies from the U.S. government. And that's the most expensive energy there is. It's many, many times more expensive than clean natural gas." So Robb, from your experience, let's start with how do the costs of wind energy generation compare with other generation sources here in Atlantic Canada?
Yeah, I think it's all about your jurisdiction. So what I like to talk about is what America does is not necessarily what the world does. If you look at the world, wind is the cheap form of energy. It is the cheap. Now, it does not solve all the problems. I've said that many times before. It's not a silver bullet, but it does add a lot of value. And the low cost of power is probably the biggest benefit besides this renewable portion of the of the equation for a wind project. If you look at Europe, for example, you look at what the cost of energy is, you're going to find that wind energy is the cheapest form of energy compared to building new assets. What happens, though, is when it's compared to a fully depreciated asset in terms of that it's already been paid for, and all it is that you just put gas into it or you put coal into it, then yes, that's going to be very cheap. But so will wind turbines when they're 25 years old and you don't have to pay back debt or anything like that. They'll be the cheapest form again. So for new energy, wind turbines are definitely the cheapest form. He talks a lot about subsidies, and subsidies are important. I think subsidies happen throughout all of our economy. So that's a difficult one to talk about. Here in Canada, there is a recent subsidy that has come in, which is the ITC. Again, that is a tax policy, and ultimately you will pay for that in the long term. It's really comes down to when you pay for the asset.
Yeah, and those ITCs, the investment tax credits, I think they're important because, looking at decarbonization goals, they are societal goals. They're goals for Canada. And understandably, the government is trying to shift some of that burden of decarbonizing from ratepayers, electricity ratepayers, to all taxpayers. And there's certainly a strong justification for doing so, especially to support those, maybe newer or industries that are still maturing, like wind and solar to a degree, and certainly other types of more nascent clean energy sources that different utilities around the country are exploring. And I think
that's a really good point, Jonathan. If you think about wind energy, the idea that you have to change is the big part. So we could run the system now and continue to pollute, but if you want to update your system, there is a cost to making that change, that transition over. And that's really what we're talking about here, is that transition.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's important too for listeners and viewers right now to remember that electrical utilities in Atlantic Canada are highly regulated, and every time they want to bring forward a new investment or development project, they need to go through a utility board to justify those costs as being the most effective one for ratepayers. So, for example, anytime Nova Scotia Power or MB Power, they develop an integrated resource plan, or they call them IRPs, they're looking at the cost of, what is the most cost-effective mix to deliver reliable energy to ratepayers. And, all those utilities in the region have found that wind is part of that most cost-effective mix of electricity generation moving forward.
Exactly.
Rob, do you think that President Trump was correct that wind projects only work financial with subsidies in place? Is this true in Atlantic Canada, moving forward, even after the investment tax credits wrap up after 2030?
No, I don't think so. I can give you examples of why I don't believe that. If you look at in the very beginning of my career in 2005, 2006, we were talking about wind energy and contracting then, and the price back then was 6.9 cents was a winning bid. That price has fluctuated up and down, but in general, that's where wind energy is sit. And when you look at the avoided cost of energy across utilities, that's in keeping with what prices they can afford. And so I don't believe it's the highest cost. I think that there's a lot more issues coming due with trying to keep these older plants running. I think there's a cost that's associated with it. And so we really need to think about how to update the grid effectively. And one of the ways is to go with low cost wind.
Yeah, I absolutely. I completely agree. So President Trump mentioned also the concept of clean natural gas. And I guess one thing I don't strictly agree with, as you know, Rob, our work with Atlantica doesn't place one technology ahead of another. And I certainly believe that there's a role for natural gas in Atlantic Canada's energy future. But I have a bit of a problem with the term clean natural gas, though, because I think it wrongly implies for some listeners that natural gas produces few to no emissions. And that's just not true, of course. although modern natural gas combustion turbines to generate electricity are obviously much lower emitting than some of the coal assets we still use in Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. But can you speak to the benefits of natural gas actually and how it relates with wind generation in the region? Are there clean benefits to natural gas, other than, directly combusting it?
Yeah, I think there's weaknesses with renewable energy, just like there's weaknesses with natural gas. I actually think they complement each other quite well in the near term, for sure. Who knows what will happen in 20 years with new technologies? Maybe wind energy will be no good anymore. Maybe natural gas won't be needed anymore. But I think right now, it's really essential that the two work together. It's essential that we do not just go all in on one resource. It's a big mistake, and it's done so often, is that we think that we must do only this. And when you look at what the utilities are planning, they are planning on using more natural gas because they understand that it's necessary for the reliable operation of the grid, that not only do you have low-cost renewable energy, but you also try to use as green as possible fossil fuels to make sure that you continue to have a reliable grid on cold days when it's not windy.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree. So President Trump went on to state later in the interview, you can talk about windmills. They litter our country. They're littered all over our country, like dropping paper, like dropping garbage in a field. And that's what happens to them because over a period of time, they turn to garbage. I was a little unclear of what the president meant with the garbage comment, but he went on to explain after 10 years, you have to redo them, referring to windmills. And what happens is they don't do that. They let them stand, they rust, they save because it's a certain fiberglass that the blades cannot be buried in the earth. And by they, he's referring to developers like Natural Forces. But Rob, is this true? Can we start with whether wind projects only produce electricity for 10 years in Atlantic Canada? Is that true?
No, it's absolutely not true. If you look at the earliest wind turbines that were placed in the Atlantic provinces, they're still running today. It's like a good car. If you treat it poorly, it won't last long. You must do the maintenance, and you have to put the time and money into them. I think that's why the way that our utilities contract is so important. They contract on long-term PPAs so that the projects continue to run and people continue to put the money into them so that in general, turbines life cycle is design. The design life is 20 years. But that, when you talk about design life, that doesn't mean that they don't last longer. It just means throughout all the movement, we think every component will last so long. So perhaps in a certain wind regime, maybe the blades are the first ones that we have to do some work to. So there will be a blade replacement. The rest of the turbine still works very well. Or perhaps there's a gearbox that requires a substitution. You take that gearbox in, you put a new one in there, it continues to operate. Those are costs, but they don't mean that the project has to be totally redone. The issue that the president talks about is really an issue with how their tax credit works. Their tax credit works on a 10-year process. So they get paid for 10 years with their tax credit. And then because of the newer technology and because they get the tax credit again, they redo their projects occasionally. That happens a lot in Texas, where the cost of power is so low, and actually it's more a tax credit play than it is. Up here in Canada, we don't have that problem. We can't go back for more tax credits. You get your one and you're done. You have to own the project for over 20 years. Otherwise, they claw it all back. So we are all incentivized to continue to operate the projects well and make them last well past 20 years. For example, in BC, we have a PPA that is for 40 years, and we will keep those projects running for 40 years. It will require major maintenance to be done, just like a hydro plant does, just like a gas plant or any other project around.
Well, thanks for clearing that up. So, after those 20, hopefully plus years, can you explain though the decommissioning rules for windmills and wind farms in Atlantic Canada? Like, what processes do natural forces or project owners of a wind project have to do when eventually it needs to be retired?
Yeah, we haven't had to deal with decommissioning yet, but it's something that we deal with our landowners constantly with to make sure that they feel solid in how we decommission. Generally, what we do is we take the blades off, take the tower down, and then dig down the foundation and take the first 2 meters off the foundation, take that out, and reclimate the soil. Most of the turbine parts are recyclable. The blades are the one issue. They are working on that issue to try to figure out a better way to recycle them. But generally what they are done is they are either landfilled or they are repurposed in some other fashion. I would say there's a lot of good research being done on them to figure out what to do with them. And I'm certain that we'll come up with a solution before we actually have to decommission a project.
Yeah, absolutely. And that decommissioning cost, is that borne by the project developer and owner in the life of the contract, or is that something that needs to be paid for by ratepayers or landowners after the fact?
That's completely borne by the operator. So that is part of the contract that we have with our land projects, our landowners, sorry.
I think that's an important stipulation. And one thing, I've heard what would be certainly valid concerns about for these wind development projects, but knowing how things operate in Atlantic Canada, I think it's something we should be proud and, really be rest assured about isn't going to become an issue long into the future.
Yeah, and I think if you look at some of the decommissioned projects, I know in Nova Scotia, there have been a few that have been taken down. If you look at them, they've all been done in that manner. They're all taken down, looked after, and the site is reclamated appropriately. If you think of the amount of steel that is in the towers alone, that would easily pay for any cost it would take to knock down the towers.
Yeah, absolutely. So before we finish up, Rob, I'd like to discuss a comment back to the Landman series. As you know, Atlantica really likes to look forward to the future to help understand what role energy is going to play here in economic development and obviously to reduce emissions as well. And Billy Bob Thornton's characters went on to state, if the whole world decided to go electric tomorrow, we don't have the transmission lines to get the electricity to cities. It'd take 30 years if we started tomorrow. And he added, we have 120 years of petroleum-based infrastructure that our lives depend on. I certainly think, it's true that we have, 120 years of petroleum-based infrastructure here too, but we also have, 100 years of electricity infrastructure in place in the region. I, do agree that it's probably going to take 30 years from today to fully electrify and build the transmission infrastructure, new generation we're going to need to make it happen. But this is really where my personal opinions or personal agreements end with the statement. But I'll give you first a chance to respond. Do you agree with the sentiment that because much of our lives depend on petroleum-based infrastructure, that we shouldn't take the effort needed to move away from it?
I mean, absolutely not. I agree with the statement that he generally says, like, of course, we can't change overnight. What change ever happens overnight? And he might be right. It probably would take close to 30 years to change. But I always go back to, let's look at our history. In the late 1800s, the conversation was, there's too many horses. We can't deal with all the horse poop everywhere. It's clogging up the drains. Everything stinks. We don't have enough people to pull all that out. And then all of a sudden we changed to cars, and all the jobs that had to do with horses went away and they changed. That happens. Now, I don't think it should happen overnight. I definitely think that petroleum will have a large part to play in our lives, especially probably for the rest of my life. But we need to start making strides towards change for the better. And nobody thinks that we should stop drilling oil. I definitely think that we need to do that to keep our lives going, but we need to change and we have to take the first step. And so electrification is the first step. I don't think everybody needs to have an electric car, but it certainly helps if some people do. If people can deal with having an electric car, that's great. People can't because they have to drive where there's not infrastructure yet. then it makes sense. They should stay with petroleum based. And so that's how I really feel about this, is that we don't have all the answers. We don't know what we're going to run into, but we do have to make the first step up the hill.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think one of the things I'm most excited for in Atlantic Canada is our potential to develop wind, whether that be onshore, offshore, and other renewables. We have huge amounts of potential to do it for our own needs and potentially for export as well. When you look at things like you mentioned that are going to be harder to, decarbonize or electrify, like heavy transportation, marine shipping, fuel, some industry, I think there's going to be a growing role for clean fuels like renewable diesel, sustainable aviation fuel. Obviously, we've heard lots of discussion about the potential to develop clean hydrogen in the region. And we can use wind, solar, other renewable assets that we have here that we can still build out here in large number to help produce those clean fuels as well, to reduce emissions that aren't going to be coming from electrification. So, I think the natural gas grid at some point in the future, we'll be referring to it as a gas grid, and that's a great thing. There's still going to be a role for fuels, but to your point, we should all be working towards a future where we can decarbonize those sectors while still, maintaining the quality of life that we enjoy today.
Absolutely. I don't think that this is going to be a straight line. There'll be some zigs to the line. We'll try some things, they won't work very well. But that goes back to my comment. You just can't bet everything on one number. You have to place your bets strategically around and try to find out the best solution for each grid. Each grid is different. Each grid has different requirements. And so we really have to invest in planning and making a map for the next 30 years so that we can make it in 30 years, because we can't do it right now, but we should be in a position that in 30 years, we will be there if we want to be.
Completely agree. Look, thank you again, Robb, for joining the Atlantica Fuel for Thought podcast. And I encourage all the listeners and viewers to learn more about natural forces and the Atlantica Centre for Energy by visiting their websites, which are available in the show notes below. Until next time, keep learning about energy.